Welcome to our fun little study group for PP 5340, Introduction to Public Policy and Management. This is part one of the readings from Section 11, Cultural Competence, Reparations, and Public Policy.
Hey there.
Today, we're embarking on a deep dive that really challenges some foundational assumptions of public service.
Yeah, specifically this relentless drive for efficiency.
Exactly. And how that efficiency, well, it often seems to come at the direct expense of justice and equity.
That's right. Our mission today is to sort of pull apart the historical and ethical trade-offs that are embedded in public administration, particularly when we're dealing with issues of race and vulnerability.
We're moving from the theory, the abstract ideas, into some pretty devastating practice.
And then examining the policy remedies needed for what look like truly systemic failures.
Yeah. The central question we have to grapple with is, what happens when that ethic of just getting things done overrides the ethical responsibility to do things justly, especially for communities without much political power.
It's a tough one.
We've got a critical stack of sources to guide us through this complex dilemma. First up, we have Public Administration, Diversity, and the Ethic of Getting Things Done by Mohammed G. Alkadri, Brandy Blessed, and Valerie L. Pattison. We'll just call that source one.
Okay.
Second, we're diving into the institutional arguments in Never Post-Racial, The Persistence of the Dual State by Matthew T. Witt. That's source 2.
Got it.
And finally, we connect the dots with the policy solution explored in Past Due, The African American Quest for Reparations by Robert L. Allen, which is source 3.
Quite a lineup.
Definitely. Let's jump straight into that tension, right at the heart of public service. Okay, let's unpack this with source 1. It throws us immediately into this ethical conflict that seems to dominate modern bureaucracy.
Right, this tension between measured outcomes, performance, and fundamental ethical conduct.
And the core of this tension, the authors call it the New Old Creed. What's that about?
The New Old Creed, yeah. It refers to this resurgence of economic rationalism in public admin, really since the 1980s.
Managerialism, performance accountability.
Benchmarking, right. All those buzzwords. The focus has been singularly relentless. Results matter above all else. Public managers get rewarded for measurable outcomes.
But source 1 challenges whether this obsession with outcomes creates an inherent, negative value trade-off, especially for minority populations.
Exactly. Does it? That's the question.
It seems like that drive for efficiency and measurable success, the stuff often championed under new public management, it encourages administrators to adopt a kind of tunnel vision.
Mm-hmm.
We saw this maybe in education policies like No Child Left Behind. The pressure to hit those benchmarks sometimes led to what the authors call unethical behaviors.
Like what?
Well, schools excluding weaker students, maybe teachers cheating, or low-performing students being kind of encouraged to drop out just so the school could meet survival standards.
Right. The goal became achieving the score, not necessarily serving all students ethically.
Precisely. And this is why the traditional public administration values economy, effectiveness, efficiency. They often clash fiercely with what's now seen as the fourth pillar, social equity.
Social equity. It's defined broadly, but Johnson and Svara, back in 2011, they sort of nailed it down as ensuring that all social groups will have the same prospects for success and the same opportunities to be protected from the adversities of life.
So if you focus only on efficiency, you often compromise equity. It's almost built in.
It can be, yeah, especially if you're not consciously guarding against it.
So to understand why administrators might compromise equity, we need to look at these three main ethical frameworks they rely on, often subconsciously, right? Source 1 uses Vara's 2007 ethics triangle model. Can you walk us through how these frameworks interact?
Absolutely. The first one, maybe the most traditional in bureaucracy, is deontology.
Deontology, okay.
This is the ethics of duty and rules. It's strict adherence to organizational protocol procedures. It provides an external ethical guide.
Like the classic Weberian bureaucrat, follow the rule book no matter what.
Exactly. Follow the rule book. It provides predictability, structure.
But wait, if we're prioritizing predictable, rule-based bureaucracy deontology, doesn't that kind of conflict with the third framework you mentioned, virtue intuition? Isn't that about the administrator's character?
That's a powerful point, and yeah, the tension is real. But maybe the most immediate tension, the one Source 1 really focuses on, arises with the second framework. Teleology.
Teleology.
This is the utilitarian philosophy. Only the consequences matter. The guiding principle is basically Get the job done by any means necessary.
So prioritizing efficiency, cost-benefit analysis.
Whatever market outcome is desired, yeah.
Yeah.
When results-based management dominates, administrators get pushed strongly toward teleology.
Okay, so deontology is following the rules, teleology is getting the outcome. Where does virtue intuition fit in again?
Virtue ethics is kind of the moral ballast. It shifts the focus away from just strict rules or outcomes and towards the moral character of the administrator. Their duty, their principles, their commitment to pursuing the public interest, which should include social equity. Right. The problem, as Source 1 highlights, is that results-based management heavily favors teleology. It prioritizes outcomes you can measure easily, a road built, a budget cut.
Often at the expense of ethical conduct when dealing with vulnerable folks, people without the political capital to fight back.
Precisely. Teleology minimizes those contextual factors. It lets economic goals override social ones.
This tension explains why groups like the American Society for Public Administration, ASPA, felt they needed to keep revising their code of ethics. Since, what, 1984?
Yeah, since its inception, the code's been updated several times, trying to integrate virtue ethics more strongly.
Making it more aspirational.
Yes, the revisions, particularly in 2011 and 2013, moved toward that aspirational language. They tried to elevate specific concepts to core principles. Crucially, they formally elevated three concepts: social equity,
Right.
democratic participation in governance, and the obligation to provide full information and advice.
That sounds like a deliberate attempt to force administrators to actually confront disparities in access and engagement.
It was.
That sounds good on paper, but Source 1 asks the really tough practical question. How do you enforce these aspirational principles when they're based on moral duty, not strict legal mandates?
That's the rub.
You can punish an administrator for breaking a rule that's deontology, but how do you punish them for lacking virtue, for failing on the virtue intuition front?
It's hard. And the authors argue that unless accountability moves beyond just mere compliance, beyond simply ticking the boxes and starts incorporating character and principle, administrators can stay morally mute.
They can say, I followed protocol, even while executing policies that are devastating to certain communities.
Exactly. The failure to integrate ethics testing and a real focus on consequences means teleology remains the easiest path, the fastest path. It lets bureaucratic efficiency mask profound injustice.
And this brings us perfectly to Overtown, Miami. Source 1 uses this case study as the painful, concrete evidence of what happens when performance-driven public administration just abandons social equity.
For the new old creed, yeah.
We are talking about the deliberate dismantling of a thriving community in the mid-20th century.
This is one of the most sobering examples out there. Overtown, historically known as the Central Negro District or Colored Town, it was a truly vibrant economic hub. They called it the Harlem of the South.
Wow.
In the 1930s through the 50s, it held almost a third of Miami's population, packed densely into less than 10% of the city's land.
Yeah.
But it supported over 350 businesses.
350 businesses, including medical services, entertainment.
Nightclubs, theaters, you name it.
So it was a self-sufficient, economically viable community built during segregation. But the problem, as defined by the powerful white civic elite, was simply its location.
Right. As early as the 1930s, business leaders saw Overtown as valuable real estate right next to the expanding downtown Miami.
And this strategic desire immediately turned into public policy.
The Dade County Commission approved a Negro resettlement plan way back in 1936. The public administrators then became the essential agents for moving the African-American community 5 miles away to Liberty City.
Liberty City, a newly constructed neighborhood intentionally separated from white areas by a wall.
A physical 4 to 5 foot concrete wall? Yes.
Wow. So the administrative actions started subtly, but then escalated.
They did. The first tool was housing policy. Liberty Square Public Housing was set up as the new nucleus, but Overtown residents were slow to leave the community they'd built, understandably.
So administrators used the power of enforcement.
Right. In 1947, they intensified code enforcement inspections. They applied new, stricter minimum housing requirements to low-income households, many of whom were renters or elderly homeowners.
And they couldn't afford the mandated repairs.
Often not. So they were effectively coerced into selling their property, often at depressed prices, to the city's redevelopment agencies.
The case of Rachel Williams you mentioned is just heartbreaking. Forced to take only $7,000 for 2 double lots.
Yeah, she recounted assuming she just had to move. The deposited checks served as proof of sale.
Effectively transferring generational wealth and land from black residents to the state or private partners.
who then resold it for downtown expansion. And this whole process was enabled, even accelerated, by federal policy
The
frameworks.
Housing Acts of 37 and 49.
Exactly. They gave local administrators critical discretion over public housing locations and occupancy, and those decisions directly contributed to concentrating Black families in impoverished second ghetto communities on the city's edge.
This wasn't just neglect, it was active, policy-driven segregation.
Absolutely. And it continued. The Adker lawsuit in 1987 alleged housing administrators were still racially steering public housing tenants even then.
Unbelievable. But even with these heavy-handed housing and code enforcement tactics, Overtown wasn't entirely cleared out yet.
No. The final fatal administrative blow came via transportation policy,
Right.
the Interstate Highway Act of 1956.
This gave Miami administrators huge discretion over how to route the new interstate infrastructure.
Immense discretion. And the initial engineering plans were actually designed to minimize disruption. They looped traffic away from developed areas.
But local administrators, working with the Florida Road Department and the powerful Miami civic elite, they scrapped those plans.
Entirely. The chosen new plan sliced directly through Overtown, vertically with I-95 and horizontally with I-395, just cut right through it.
And the rationale researchers identified, it's just damning.
It is. Cheaper land, administratively easier to deal with fewer, larger property owners.
And critically, Black residents in Overtown had little political voice. Their objections could be ignored.
Easily disregarded. The consequences were instant, catastrophic. The highway interchange uprooted 10,000 residents.
A quarter of the population.
Gone. And it physically divided the community into 4 isolated quadrants. Wiped out most of the business corridor from 274 businesses in '67 down to just 41 a few decades later.
Overtown wasn't inefficient, it was just rendered collateral damage.
Collateral damage for the sake of downtown expansion and efficient highway traffic flow.
This perfectly illustrates that ethical failure. The administrators achieved the teleological outcome: the road got built, downtown Miami expanded, traffic flowed.
But they did it by maneuvering to serve powerful business interests while completely abdicating social responsibility to powerless residents.
This is what Adams and Balfour called the agentic shift.
Exactly. The administrator feels responsible only to the hierarchy or the job requirements. I was just doing my job, building the road, while transferring or just ignoring any personal or social responsibility for the effects of their decision on the community itself.
And Source One's main takeaway is that intent is irrelevant when the outcome is this devastating.
Right. The authors argue ethics testing must accompany performance management. Accountability has to be based on outcomes, regardless of the administrator's claim of just following the rules.
Okay, so the administrative failures in Overtown, they weren't random, were they? Not just isolated ethical lapses. Source 2, never post-racial, the persistence of the dual state, suggests these local failures are symptoms of something much older, much deeper.
That is the core argument, yeah. Source 2 fundamentally challenges that comfortable story, the triumphalist narrative, that the U.S. has been on this smooth, steady path toward racial equality since the Civil War.
It argues the U.S. is never post-racial because racism isn't just some fading relic. It's actually a central pillar of state legitimacy. How does that work?
It's based on the philosopher Charles Mills from 1997, who talked about white supremacy operating as a racialized social contract.
Okay.
This contract acts as this unstated global paradigm of governance designed specifically to reproduce racial stratification. So the U.S. government functions as a dual state built on this contract.
A dual state, meaning?
It means one set of privileges and entitlements is reserved for the white population, the deserving, while the other side of the state actively practices exclusion, extraction, and penalization against racial minorities.
And the sources show this mechanism has been at work for like a century of modern public policy. Let's start with the New Deal and the Fair Deal. Many people see these as the height of progressive, inclusive government. But Source 2 shows they were systematically racist in how they were applied. How did administrators manage that?
It was a very calculated political trade-off. To get the essential votes of Southern congressional Democrats for big legislation like the Social Security Act or the Wagner Act for union rights, policymakers consciously excluded farm labor and domestic labor, jobs predominantly held by Black workers.
Excluded them from Social Security benefits, minimum wages, union representation.
Right, well into the 1950s.
But it gets worse, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The compromise went beyond just exclusion. Congress agreed that these new programs would be administered locally.
Entirely according to local authority, yes, and that guaranteed racist exclusion. The political scientist Ira Katznelson documented how local administrators, especially in the South, just leveraged this control. They applied rules selectively to make sure even eligible Black Americans got fewer benefits or were simply shut out.
So the dual state used local administrative discretion to enforce federal segregation.
Disguised as local political control, reinforcing the whole system of white supremacy.
Okay, this leads us to the post-war period.
Mm-hmm.
The government creates the single biggest vehicle for intergenerational wealth in American history, homeownership.
Mm-hmm.
How did federal policy make sure substantially less of that benefit went to veterans and citizens of color?
This is absolutely crucial. The Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, and the GI Bill mandates after World War II were key. FHA policies actively endorsed restrictive covenants.
Those agreements tied to property deeds forbidding sales to minorities.
Yes, and the FHA established the practice of redlining.
Let's unpack redlining for a second, because its impact is huge but maybe misunderstood. What exactly did the FHA do?
Okay, so the FHA created these color-coded maps of cities. Green areas were safe for guaranteed mortgage loans. Red areas were flagged as hazardous.
And hazard was explicitly defined by the race of the residents.
Explicitly. By refusing to insure mortgages in these minority-heavy areas from 1933 all the way to 1978, the FHA basically starved those communities of capital.
It prevented Black families from getting the low-interest, government-backed loans that were building massive wealth for white families in the new suburbs.
Exactly. If you can't get a mortgage, you can't build equity. No equity, no wealth to pass on. Simple as that.
And the Housing Act of 1954 continued this, empowering local authorities to adopt renewal plans that guaranteed separate, unequal housing. Basically, more ghetto building.
That's right, which led the Kerner Commission in '68 to that unavoidable conclusion. White institutions created the ghetto, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it.
So when the civil rights movement finally dismantled segregation by law, de jure segregation, the institutional backlash was already gearing up.
Already underway. Political strategists like Kevin Phillips in 1969, they codified the Southern strategy, linking the Democratic Party to Black activism and court-ordered integration, courting anti-Black sentiment.
That political pivot, that coded appeal, cemented the racial realignment in American politics.
It did, and this political shift provided the foundation for the new Jim Crow, mainly through mass incarceration.
The war on drugs rhetoric,
Yeah.
starting with Rockefeller's drug laws in New York in '64, accelerating under Reagan, that became a major tool of the dual state.
A huge tool. And the state actively created the conditions for it. That Military Cooperation with Civilian Law Enforcement Agencies Act in 1981, it authorized transferring military gear, intelligence training to civilian police.
Creating financial incentives for drug policing?
Exactly. And that militarization focused disproportionately on Black and brown communities.
And the disparity in outcomes just confirms the racialized intent. Federal sentencing for crack cocaine.
The form that mysteriously showed up and took hold in Black urban centers in the 80s.
Right. That sentencing was set at 100 times harsher than for powder cocaine, which was more common among white users.
100 times. The Fair Sentencing Act in 2010 finally reduced that disparity, but it's still 18-1.
Still 18-1. Showing persistent unequal treatment for the same drug remains part of the system.
It created this permanent system of state control over millions of Black men through the penal system, often trapping them outside the legitimate economy forever.
We also see this punitive approach in social welfare with PR WARA, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act in '96.
That ended welfare as we knew it.
Justified by that racist argument that earlier New Deal programs had promoted a culture of poverty.
Yeah, and this is where sociologist Loic Wacquant's analysis comes in handy. His idea of the state's right hand versus its left hand.
How does that work?
The right-hand economic policy shrinks social obligations through deregulation, cutbacks, demands individual responsibility. Meanwhile, the left-hand social services also shrinks.
So what fills the gap?
Penalization steps in. It becomes the key technique for making social problems invisible, problems the state doesn't want to treat at their roots anymore. The poor just get incarcerated or punished through welfare rolls rather than given real economic opportunity.
Okay, so if these mechanisms we've just talked about, administrative apathy in Overtown, systemic exclusion in the New Deal, deliberate wealth destruction via FHA, and mass incarceration, if they're all functions of this dual state, then it leads, almost inevitably, to the central theme of Source 3, the quest for reparations. And this isn't some modern political fad, is it? This call goes back centuries.
It truly does. Source 3 documents how the demand for reparations has been constant, and it crosses ideological lines within the African American community.
As early as 1854, an emigrationist convention calling for a national indemnity.
Exactly. And post-Civil War, Sojourner Truth organized a petition campaign for free public land, famously declared, "America owes to my people some of the dividends she can afford to pay, and she must pay."
Wow. The push continued right through the 1890s with Callie House filing lawsuits.
Then it got highly politicized and organized in the mid-20th century. You had groups ranging from the Nation of Islam demanding a separate, fertile state to James Foreman's Black Manifesto in 1969, demanding $500 million from churches to fund black self-determination.
And this culminated in explicit policy demands, like from the Republic of New Africa in 1972, demanding $300 billion.
Yes, and explicitly framing slavery as a form of unjust warfare, which is actually a recognized concept in international law for compensation.
So the underlying argument for reparations, it's about addressing systematic, long-term capital loss. What's the fundamental moral and economic justification here?
Well, the moral debt is pretty straightforward. Centuries of forced unpaid slave labor built so much of the early American economy.
Yeah.
And economist Manning Marable argues capitalism didn't just ignore Black America. The state was intimately involved in the expropriation of surplus value from Black workers.
Taking the economic value they created without paying them.
Exactly. And then actively blocking capital accumulation after emancipation.
And this block started way back in the colonial era.
Yeah.
Laws establishing racial slavery, making it hereditary.
As early as 1662 in Virginia. But maybe the state's most critical failure was during Reconstruction. We hear about 40 acres and a mule. What exactly was the policy that failed?
Yeah, what was that?
The failure was the federal government's refusal to actually enact land redistribution. The original Freedmen's Bureau Act, which got vetoed, would have assigned 40 acres to every male citizen. Later, Congressman Thaddeus Stevens proposed a plan in 1867 to confiscate planter lands and grant 40 acres and $50 to freed families.
Congress rejected it.
Rejected it.
And the consequence of that rejection was basically ensuring economic subservience.
Absolutely. That failure ensured millions of freed slaves were left as propertyless sharecroppers, wage workers, immediately dependent on their former enslavers. It blocked the creation of any independent economic base.
W.E.B. Du Bois observed that providing land could have made a basis of real democracy.
That might easily have transformed the modern world. That opportunity was deliberately shut down by the state.
And Source 3 makes it clear that even after the Civil Rights Movement, state policies kept enforcing this capital disparity. This is the root of that massive white wealth gap Oliver and Shapiro identified.
That disparity is the quantifiable effect of the dual state. You know, while middle-class Black families might approach middle-class white families in income, white families typically have a net worth 8 to 10 times larger.
8 to 10 times.
And the authors stress this gap isn't because of normal capitalism or personal failings. It's due to the racialization of the state. The systematic ways government policy transferred and protected wealth for whites while denying it to Black citizens.
We keep circling back to the FHA and redlining. That policy, lasting until 1978, effectively excluded African Americans from the single greatest opportunity for mass wealth accumulation in the 20th century. How do economists even quantify the long-term cost of that?
The cost is just staggering.
Yeah.
And ongoing. Economist David Swinton argues these historic capital disparities prevent racial equality, even if all current discrimination just magically stopped today. Oliver and Shapiro actually calculated the cost of being Black in the housing market in 1992 alone.
Just 1 year.
1 year. That cost from higher interest rates, lost equity, denied mortgages was an estimated $82 billion.
$82 billion in 1 year. From just housing disparity. That puts the scale of this in a whole new light.
It really does. And that economic reality is why these policy efforts toward reparations have become so persistent. The most visible effort is the Conyers Bill, originally H.R. 40, now H.R. 891. It's been introduced into Congress almost every session since 1989.
And that effort was directly inspired by the U.S. government's actions toward Japanese Americans.
Exactly. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provided compensation for Japanese Americans unjustly interned during World War II.
That set a powerful domestic precedent, compensating citizens for state-sanctioned injustice.
It's a huge precedent. And it's crucial to understand what H.R. 40 actually proposes. It doesn't just grant compensation right away.
No, what does it do?
It calls for an $8 million commission to conduct a comprehensive study. This commission would investigate four key areas. One, the extent of federal and state support for slavery from 1619 to 1865. Two, the nature of subsequent de jure and de facto discrimination against descendants. Three, the lingering negative effects today.
And four,
Recommendations for remedies, which must include a formal apology and payment of compensation.
so it's about study and recommendation first. Now, the idea of collective compensation for historic wrongs is not unique globally either, is it? Source 3 mentions international precedents.
Yeah, Germany is the most frequently cited precedent. Starting in 1952, Germany paid over $58 billion in today's dollars to Holocaust survivors and the State of Israel for the crimes under Nazi rule.
That demonstrates large-scale, state-funded capital transfers to correct historical crimes are actually politically and financially feasible.
That can be done. And domestically, beyond the Japanese internment compensation, what other examples are there?
Well, there's the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in 1971, nearly $1 billion and 44 million acres of land. And maybe closer to the scale of race-based historical atrocity, the Florida legislature in 1995 provided compensation, $150,000 each, to survivors of the Rosewood Massacre.
Where a black community was violently destroyed in 1923.
These domestic cases confirm the legal and administrative framework for reparations exists. The political will seems to be the main obstacle.
That's often the case. Now, when we talk about the price tag, the numbers get astronomical, reflecting centuries of stolen labor and blocked opportunity.
Source 3 mentions estimates for the present value of unpaid slave labor vary wildly, from $96 billion to nearly $10 trillion. That kind of figure generates instant political resistance.
It does, understandably. But economist David Swinton approaches the calculation differently. He grounds it more in contemporary damage. He calculated that compensating for the damage to the capital stocks owned by the living black population today, the net effects of slavery, Jim Crow, FHA, all of it would require a capital transfer of around $500 billion.
$500 billion. Still immense, but a lot different than $10 trillion. And Source 3 argues this figure is actually economically feasible.
Yes. The authors point out that if the government eliminated certain subsidies and wasteful transfers of public funds to wealthy individuals and corporations in just a single year, much of that $500 billion could be made available.
So the argument is that these reparations aren't a genuine threat to the national economy.
And are actually modest when viewed against the total value created and stolen over centuries. They're framed not as punishment, but as a necessary redistribution of wealth, required to move toward real equality within our existing political economy.
And finally, this quest for justice has global echoes too. Source 3 reminds us of Fanon's perspective in The Wretched of the Earth.
Right. Fanon saw aid from imperial countries not as charity, but as a just reparation which will be paid to us.
Because the wealth of Europe and the West was fundamentally derived from theft.
Theft of resources and labor from underdeveloped peoples. This perspective broadens the reparations argument from just a domestic debt to a global principle of economic justice.
And the core argument remains the same.
Eliminating current discrimination is necessary, absolutely. But it's not sufficient. Without reversing the cumulative effects of state-sanctioned racial inequities through large-scale capital transfers, true equality will just remain perpetually out of reach. Hashtag tag tag outro.
Wow. We've charted a fascinating and honestly pretty devastating past today. We went from that abstract ethical conflict in public management efficiency versus equity to the concrete historical destruction of communities like Overtown. Then we looked at how the dual state systemically reinforced racial disparity through policies like the FHA and the war on drugs.
And finally landed on the urgent centuries-old case for reparations to correct the cumulative capital cost of being black in America.
The common thread across all these sources seems to be this question of administrative accountability.
It really is. If accountability requires judging not just the administrator's intent, that easy defense of, I was just doing my job, but the actual, often devastating consequences of their actions, like the standard used at the Nuremberg trials, then our standards have to shift.
So for you, the listener.
Yeah, for you listening, what rigorous ethical outcome test should accompany the next major policy decision in your community, whether it's funding schools, routing a new transit line, allocating housing funds? What test ensures that vulnerable, politically powerless citizens aren't once again just rendered collateral damage in that relentless teleological drive to simply get things done?
It's a challenge to demand that social equity, finally, takes primacy over mere efficiency.
It really is something to think about.